Reddit, the crawl space date. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only 20-somethings who live alone truly understand. It's the kind that doesn't hit you during the day when you're surrounded by the artificial lights and corporate buzz of a 9-to-5 job. It hits you at 2:30 a.m. when the ambient noise of the world dies down and you suddenly realize that the only beating heart within a 50-yard radius is your own. 2 years ago, when I turned 24, I landed my first real corporate job as a junior financial analyst at a prestigious firm downtown. For me, it was the ultimate milestone of adulthood. I wanted to celebrate my new salary by buying my independence. No more college dorms, no more annoying roommates stealing my groceries, and no more curfew rules from my parents. I wanted a space that was entirely, unconditionally mine. I found a place that felt like an absolute dream in the historic northern suburbs. It was a massive late 19th century Victorian house surrounded by an acre of unkempt grass and ancient oak trees. The landlord had cleverly split the historic house into 2 completely separate living units. I rented the entire upper floor, which included the converted attic space and the second floor. It was beautiful, exposed dark oak beams, high ceilings, and a private wooden stairwell leading up from the side of the house. But it was isolated. The nearest neighbor's house was over 50 yards away, completely hidden behind a dense, dark barrier of weeping willows and overgrown pines. When the sun went down, the backyard became a yawning abyss of blackness. And then there was the architecture of the house itself. If you've ever lived in an old western suburban home, you know they are full of hollow, forgotten spaces. This house sat on an elevated foundation, creating a 3-foot crawl space, a dark, dusty void of dirt, stone pillars, and exposed pipes right beneath the first-floor apartments. There was also a massive, damp concrete basement, accessible only through a heavy wooden hatch door, located outside, tucked beneath the wraparound porch. The lower unit of the house was occupied by a man named Arthur. He was in his late 20s, a senior data analyst who worked entirely from home. Arthur was the literal definition of an intellectual. He wore thin, wire-rimmed glasses, perfectly ironed button-down shirts, and spoke with a calm, clinical precision that made him seem incredibly safe. He was polite, almost performatively so. Whenever a delivery package arrived for me on the shared porch, he would carry it up my private wooden stairs and leave it neatly outside my door. He would always leave a small post-it note written in beautiful, flawless cursive, telling me he found it on the main porch and hoping I was having a productive week. I thought he was just an awkward, sweet tech guy being a good neighbor. But after 3 months of living there, the silence of the house started to feel heavy. My social life was practically non-existent. Between the exhausting corporate hours and the long commute, I didn't have the energy to go to bars. So, like every other single independent 20-something trying to find a connection, I downloaded Tinder. It became a mindless habit, swiping through profiles right before going to bed just to feel less alone. One night, I matched with a guy named Julian. Julian's profile felt completely different from the endless sea of gym selfies and superficial bios. He was 28, a postdoctoral researcher in behavioral psychology at the local university. In his profile pictures, he looked incredibly refined, sitting in a dimly lit coffee shop, wearing a dark wool sweater, reading a vintage paperback. His bio was a single sentence that caught my attention. Modern society forces us to wear masks to survive. Let's take them off. Tell me what truly terrifies you, and I'll tell you why it defines who you are. I swiped right and the match was instantaneous. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, but looking back, the red flags were everywhere. He didn't ask generic questions. He bypassed the small talk and began asking deep, highly specific questions about my life, my routine, and my psychology. He texted me on our second night, saying that living alone in an old suburban house must be fascinating. He asked if I ever felt like the house itself was monitoring me, noting that old wood expands and contracts at night, often mimicking the rhythmic sound of a stranger breathing. I laughed it off, texting back that the house didn't scare me. It was the city. I told him I often had to work late, and the underground parking garage at my office tower gave me worst-case scenario nightmares because it was entirely isolated down there. Julian replied within less than a minute. He called it a modern architectural trap, specifically asking if it was level B3. He remarked that concrete structures absorb sound perfectly, meaning a human being could disappear down there and the bustling world above would never hear a thing. Then he asked me to tell him more about my office routine, claiming he found human vulnerabilities absolutely fascinating. That was red flag number one. I was too naive to see it. I thought he was just being an intellectual, a passionate psychologist, analyzing the world. I didn't realize he wasn't just making conversation. He was gathering data. He was building a map. We agreed to meet on a rainy Tuesday evening at the Obsidian, a low-lit underground cocktail lounge downtown. It was the kind of place where the booths were deep, high, and enclosed in dark velvet, offering total privacy from the rest of the room. When Julian walked in, he looked exactly like his photos. The wire-rimmed glasses, the neat side-parted hair, the tailored wool coat. But the moment he sat down across from me, a strange, unexplainable chill settled over our table. Have you ever met someone whose eyes never seem to rest naturally? He stared at me. He didn't blink for lengths of time that felt biologically wrong. His intense gaze was fixed entirely on my face, tracking the movement of my lips, the way my fingers nervously fidgeted with the cocktail napkin, the way my collarbone moved when I swallowed. He told me I was far more expressive in person. He said that online, I hid my anxiety behind exclamation points, but in reality, I was deeply guarded and my shoulders were incredibly tense. I forced a nervous laugh, taking a long sip of my drink, and said it was just stress from the new job, since the corporate ladder isn't exactly a relaxing environment. Julian agreed, leaning forward across the table. The candlelight caught his glasses, turning the lenses into blank, white circles that hid his eyes entirely. He asked why I actively sought isolation, choosing a house far away from neighbors and living directly above another human being while choosing not to know him. He questioned why our generation craves independence so desperately, yet fears the vulnerability that comes with it. The conversation continued like that for 2 hours. It was intellectually stimulating, but it was also deeply exhausting. Every time I tried to ask about his research, his background, or his friends, he would smoothly steer the conversation back to my vulnerabilities. He wanted to know about my commute. He asked about my Uber rides. He asked if I checked the child locks when I got into a stranger's car. I told him I always did, and that I always shared my live location with my mother. Julian murmured that it was smart, but then added that a location sharing only works if the cellular device remains powered on, and if the person watching the screen actually knows what they are looking for. That was red flag number 2. It felt less like a romantic date and more like a psychological deposition. When the bill came, he paid without asking and escorted me back up to the street level. The rain was pouring violently now, splashing heavily against the pavement and flooding the gutters. He offered to drive me home, his hand lightly resting on the small of my back. Even through my thick winter coat, his touch felt freezing cold. I pulled away slightly, saying I would just call an Uber because the surge pricing was bad, but I didn't want to take him out of his way. Julian's face became completely expressionless, his voice devoid of any warmth or emotion, as he told me he knew exactly where I lived, so it was absolutely no trouble at all. My heart did a sudden, violent flip in my chest. I asked him how he knew, since I had never given him my exact address, only that I live in the northern suburbs. Julian paused. For a fraction of a second, his smooth, intellectual demeanor cracked. A strange, twitching micro-expression passed over his jawline. Then he smiled, a wide, artificial baring of teeth that felt entirely predatory. He reminded me that I had mentioned the historic split house near the old pine reserve over text the previous week. He said there were only 3 houses matching that exact structural description in that entire zone, and since he was a behavioral researcher, he paid exquisite attention to details. I forced a fake smile, stepped into the Uber that had just pulled up to the curb, and slammed the door shut. As the car pulled away into the rainy night, I looked out the rear window. Julian was standing on the flooded sidewalk. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't move. He just stood there in the pouring rain, staring directly at the retreating car, his silhouette completely motionless under the yellow glare of the street lamp. The next morning, I woke up with an overwhelming, suffocating sense of dread. I immediately checked my phone. There were no texts from Julian. I opened Tinder to look at his profile, but our chat history was gone. He had unmatched me or completely deleted his account. I tried to convince myself it was a good thing. The guy was an absolute creep, an overbearing, pretentious intellectual who didn't understand basic human boundaries. I went to work, determined to bury my anxiety in financial spreadsheets and market reports. By Monday evening, the dread had turned into physical exhaustion. I stayed late at the office until 9:30 p.m. to finish a crucial quarterly audit. The entire glass tower was completely dead. The corporate employees had all gone home, and the cleaning crew was working on the upper floors, their distant vacuums making a faint, vibrating hum through the structure. I stepped into the elevator alone and pressed the button for level B3, the lowest, most isolated level of the underground parking garage. Level B3 was a concrete tomb. The air down there was always heavy, freezing cold, and smelled faintly of old exhaust fumes and damp mold. More than half of the fluorescent bulbs were burnt out or flickering violently, leaving massive pitch-black pockets of shadow between the thick concrete structural pillars. My silver sedan was parked in the furthest corner, right against the wet retaining wall. I stepped out of the elevator. My high heels clicked loudly against the oil-stained concrete floor. I walked past the massive concrete pillar, and then I stopped dead in my tracks. because I heard an echo. But it wasn't a perfect echo of my own shoes. It was the distinct sound of a rubber-soled shoe dragging against the grit of the concrete floor. I turned around slowly into the complete silence, broken only by the distant, low, vibrating hum of the garage ventilation shaft. I called out, asking if someone was there. My voice was trembling, sounding incredibly small and vulnerable in the vast, empty concrete space. There was no answer. I picked up my pace, walking as fast as my heels would allow, digging desperately into my purse for my car keys. My fingers were shaking so violently that I dropped my key fob. It clattered loudly against the ground, the sound echoing through the garage like a gunshot. As I bent down to grab the keys, I saw a reflection in a dark puddle of water right next to my foot. Behind a massive concrete pillar, just 15 feet behind me, a shadow was stretching out. A tall, silhouetted figure was stepping out from the darkness. He was wearing a dark black hoodie, the strings pulled tight around his face, completely concealing his features. But what caught my eye were his hands. He was wearing heavy leather gloves, and he was holding something thin and metallic, a crowbar. Suddenly, I heard heavy, rapid footsteps running aggressively toward me on the concrete. Panic took over my entire body. I grabbed my keys, lunged toward my car door, threw myself inside, and slammed the lock button down, just as a heavy gloved palm struck my driver's side window with terrifying force. I didn't look back. I started the engine, slammed the car into reverse, and tore out of that garage, my tires screaming against the concrete. Through my rearview mirror, I saw the hooded figure standing under a flickering fluorescent light. He didn't run. He didn't try to chase my car. He just raised one hand and waved, a slow, stiff, formal wave that made my stomach turn. I drove home at 80 miles an hour, tears of pure terror streaming down my face. I checked my mirrors every single second, completely convinced that a pair of headlights was tracking me through the dark, winding suburban roads. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of my house, the building was entirely dark. Arthur's downstairs window were completely black. The overgrown backyard looked like a yawning abyss of teeth. I ran up my private wooden stairs, locked the heavy door with all 3 deadbolts, and collapsed against the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't go to work the next day. I couldn't. I called in sick, claiming I had a severe migraine. I spent the entire morning sitting on my living room sofa, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring fixedly at the locked front door. That was when I first noticed the smell. At first, I thought a pipe had leaked somewhere behind the walls. It was a faint, sickeningly sweet odor, drifting up from the floorboards in the exact center of my living room. It smelled like copper, damp earth, and something old, like rotting meat left in a sealed plastic container. I opened all the windows to let the crisp autumn air in, but the smell didn't fade. It seemed to be rising directly from the narrow cracks in the old hardwood floor. Around 2 p.m., I heard heavy footsteps on the front porch downstairs. I crept over to the window and looked out. It was Arthur. He was collecting the mail from the box, looking as pristine, professional, and harmless as ever in a light gray cashmere sweater. I needed human contact. I needed to talk to someone alive to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I unlocked my door and walked down the creaky wooden stairs, meeting him on the porch. When I called his name, he turned around slowly, his movements stiff and precise. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and gave me that familiar formal nod, noting that I looked terribly pale and asking if I was feeling well. I admitted I wasn't, and then asked him if he had noticed a weird smell downstairs, like a dead animal or something rotting under the house. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly behind his lenses. His left index finger twitched rhythmically against the mail he was holding. That was a classic behavioral tell of someone concealing information, a red flag I was too exhausted to register. He told me softly, in an incredibly flat voice that lacked any natural human inflection, that he hadn't noticed any foul odors in his unit. He explained that these old Victorian structures are built over deep crawl spaces where the dirt absorbs moisture, suggesting that stray animals sometimes crawl under the foundations to die when the weather turns cold. I desperately asked if we could check it, since the smell was coming up right under my living room floor. Arthur replied smoothly that the exterior basement door was locked from the outside and that the crawl space hatch was quite dangerous due to its low clearance of barely 3 feet. He promised he would go down there that night with a high-powered flashlight and some lime powder to neutralize the odor for me, telling me I shouldn't worry and should go get some rest. I thanked him, breathing a genuine sigh of relief. That night, the house felt colder than usual. The heating system groaned loudly, but the air remained freezing. I went to bed early, leaving the hallway light fully on to combat the darkness. Suddenly, I woke up instantly, staring at the ceiling. The digital clock on my nightstand read exactly 2:14 a.m. Deep below the floorboards, I heard a low rhythmic scraping sound, like heavy canvas material dragging slowly over rough, dry dirt. The sound was coming from directly beneath my mattress. I paralyzed myself. I didn't breathe. I didn't move a muscle. The crawl space was right beneath my bedroom floorboards. Arthur had said he would go down there, but why would he be doing it at 2 in the morning? And why did the sounds feel so deliberate? I quietly slid out of bed, the freezing air hitting my bare skin. I lowered myself onto my hands and knees and pressed my ear flat against the carpet. Someone was talking down there. He was reciting something, his voice heavily muffled by the thick wood and carpet. He whispered that the subject was highly responsive to environmental stressors and that paranoia levels were currently optimal. He muttered that the physical isolation of the primary residence ensured zero external human interference and that Phase 3 was ready for implementation tonight. The muffled tone distorted the audio, but the cadence was chillingly familiar. It was slow, it was precise, it was intellectual. Then, a sharp metallic camera shutter sound resonated clearly through the floorboards. They weren't looking for a dead animal. Someone was down there, in the pitch black, 3 feet below my sleeping body, taking photos of my floorboards, tracking my movements through the sounds of my footsteps above. The next afternoon, I saw Arthur's silver sedan pull out of the gravel driveway through my window. He was leaving for his weekly grocery run. He always left at exactly 1 p.m. on Thursdays. He was a creature of absolute rigid habit. My heart was pounding a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't live in this house for another night. The police wouldn't do anything based on a muffled midnight whisper and a bad smell. They would tell me I was being paranoid. I needed physical proof. I grabbed my phone, walked down my private wooden stairs, and stepped out onto the porch. The autumn wind was biting cold. rustling the dry, dead leaves across the massive, empty backyard. I walked around the side of the house to the old wooden basement door tucked beneath the wraparound porch structure. Arthur had told me it was locked from the outside. I reached out with a trembling hand and touched the heavy iron latch. It wasn't locked. The heavy padlock was hanging open, hooked loosely through the metal eyelet. He had forgotten to snap it shut. I pulled open the massive wooden hatch door, and a wave of horrific air hit my face. It wasn't just a sweet, copper smell anymore. It was the overwhelming burning stench of industrial chemical bleach mixed with rotting organic matter. I pulled the collar of my thick sweater tightly over my nose and mouth, switched on my phone's flashlight, and stepped down into the darkness of the cellar. The basement was a standard old Western cellar, concrete floors, damp stone walls, and rusted pipes hanging from the ceiling. But in the far back corner, directly beneath the foundation of my side of the house, stood a brand new aluminum stepladder. It was positioned perfectly beneath a square wooden hatch in the ceiling, the entry to the crawl space. The wooden hatch door had been completely removed. It lay flat on the concrete floor below the ladder. I stood at the bottom of that ladder for what felt like an eternity. Every single survival instinct in my DNA was screaming at me to turn around, run to my car, and never look back. But the human mind has a tragic flaw. It craves absolute certainty, even if that certainty completely destroys your sanity. I climbed the ladder and poked my head through the narrow opening into the crawl space. The bright flashlight beam cut through thick, choking clouds of ancient dust and hanging cobwebs. The ground was entirely black, damp dirt. The vertical clearance was so low that I couldn't even stand on my knees. I had to lie completely flat on my stomach. I dragged my body forward into the dirt, swinging the flashlight beam around the dark void. In the center of the crawl space, directly beneath where my bedroom and living room were located, someone had built a makeshift, long-term living area. A thick blue plastic tarp was laid out smoothly over the damp soil. On top of it sat a high-end, military-grade cold-weather sleeping bag. A neat row of books sat next to it, advanced textbooks on behavioral psychology, criminal profiling, and several true crime paperbacks about famous stalkers. Next to the books was a high-powered digital DSLR camera mounted on a short tripod. Its massive, expensive telescopic lens was pointed vertically upward, aimed directly through a small, freshly drilled hole in the wooden floorboards above, a hole that led straight into the floor of my bedroom, right next to the left side of my bed. I crawled closer, my hands dragging through the cold, dead dirt until my flashlight beam hit a small wooden crate used as a makeshift desk. On the crate sat a black leather notebook. I opened it with a hand that was shaking so violently I could barely turn the pages. It was filled with dozens of pages of that beautiful, precise, cursive handwriting I had seen on the neighborly post-it notes. One entry noted that Olivia had entered the apartment at 10:14 p.m. and that her heart rate was likely elevated due to the level B3 garage simulation, showing excellent signs of hypervigilance. Another entry from 11:30 p.m. stated that the bathroom light was turned off, that I was pacing back and forth, and that the isolation of the house was breaking my psychological defenses down faster than anticipated. The last entry from 1:05 a.m. noted that the subject was crying softly into her pillow describing the audio frequency as highly resonant through the floorboards and calling it a fascinating emotional degradation. My breath hitched in my throat. The stalker in the office garage. It wasn't a random criminal. It was Arthur. He had tracked my office building, mapped my daily schedule, and used his knowledge of my specific phobias to orchestrate an entire simulation of terror. But it got so much worse. Next to the notebook lay a pair of thin, wire-rimmed glasses. The exact same glasses Julian wore in his Tinder photos. Julian didn't exist. Julian wasn't a researcher across town. Julian was a digital persona, a trap created by Arthur. He had used the dating app to get me to confess my absolute worst nightmares. The underground garage, the Uber rides, the fear of camera equipment, and then he used those exact confessions to torture me in real life. He didn't want to kill me, not yet. He wanted to watch a human mind unravel in real time, under his own clinical supervision. Suddenly, deep in the basement below, the heavy wooden hatch door slammed shut with a violent echoing boom. I heard the iron latch slide into place outside. My heart stopped beating. The flashlight beam shook violently in my grip. Down in the darkness of the cellar below the hatch, I heard heavy footsteps, slow, stiff, precise. Arthur's voice called out from the darkness below the crawl space opening, but it held that terrifyingly smooth, unblinking baritone of Julian from the cocktail lounge. He told me I was an excellent research subject, but that I had contaminated the testing environment and shouldn't have come down there. I don't remember everything about the next 60 seconds. It was pure, primal, animalistic survival adrenaline. I didn't try to go back down the hatch. I scrambled backward into the deepest, darkest corner of the crawl space, dragging my body through the fields as I heard Arthur begin to pull himself up into the dirt. I found a small iron ventilation grate on the exterior stone foundation wall, an old, rusted vent meant for basement airflow. I kicked it with my heavy winter boots, over and over, screaming at the top of my lungs until the rusted metal welds finally gave way. I squeezed my body through that tiny opening, tearing my heavy jacket, scraping the skin off my shoulders, and tumbled out into the overgrown wet grass of the backyard. I ran through the pine trees, ignoring the sharp branches cutting my face, until I reached the main road and flagged down a passing vehicle. The police response was massive. They raided the house, the basement, the crawl space, but Arthur was already gone. He had heard me kick the iron grate out, realized his experiment had broken out, and vanished into the dense woods behind the property before the first squad car arrived. When the forensics team inspected his downstairs apartment, it was completely barren. No furniture, no clothes, no personal belongings, no fingerprints on the walls. He had leased the entire property under a stolen identity belonging to a man who had died 5 years prior. The landlord had never even seen his real face. Everything had been handled through digital wire transfers. The police recovered the blue tarp, the tripod, and the handwritten notebook from the crawl space dirt. But the camera, the laptop, and his personal digital drives were completely gone. He had taken his files with him. It's been 2 years since that horrific night. I moved entirely across the country. I gave up the dream of suburban independence. I live in a modern, 40-story high-rise apartment complex in the middle of a massive metropolis now. There are uniformed security guards in the lobby, encrypted keycards required for the elevators, and hundreds of neighbors living all around me. No yards, no basements, No crawl spaces, just industrial concrete and structural steel. I deleted every single dating app. I never look a stranger in the eyes. I truly thought I was safe. When I look back, the most terrifying part isn't what happened, it's what is happening right now. 3 days ago, I was sitting at my desk, looking at job postings on LinkedIn. I received a private message from a premium, anonymous profile with no name, no history, and no profile picture. The message contained no introductory text. It only contained an audio file attachment. I clicked play. The audio quality shifted dramatically, becoming a low-fidelity, muffled microphone recording. It played the distinct sound of a woman snoring softly in a bed, followed by the sharp, clear sound of a digital camera shutter clicking over and over again, focusing and capturing. The audio recording was from the night before last. It was me, sleeping peacefully in my new high-rise bedroom. This modern building doesn't have a basement. It doesn't have a crawl space beneath the floor. But as I sit here in the pitch black, staring up at the silver metal ventilation shaft built into the concrete wall directly above my head, I realize something terrible. Modern residential high-rises have massive, hollow ventilation networks connecting every single living unit in the building. The continuous airflow makes it so much easier to hear a person breathe. And if you listen closely to my microphone, right now, in the absolute dead silence of the room, from deep inside that metallic air vent, a faint, rhythmic, clinical whisper is coming through. A familiar voice is saying that the subject has successfully noticed the transmission and that the paranoia levels are finally returning to optimal. Then, a sharp mechanical click echoes inside the pipe and everything cuts off into an endless, deafening static.